Well, hello again. My name's Adrian Gilbert and I'd like to welcome you back to the Invisible College. Now, today's lecture is the second in our series on alchemy. The first lecture we were looking at how it originated in Egypt as a process for really what we would today call chemistry, how to separate metals from their mineral sources, how to mix them together to make various types of amalgams, some of which looked or certainly had the appearance of gold or silver, and also how alchemists were busy extracting the essences from plants, particularly for medicine, but also brewing up beer and distilling it and distilling wine to make various kinds of spirits, which could then be used for other processes. So alchemy in its origins had a very, very practical significance. It wasn't really particularly a magical or mystical occupation at all. It was a skilled science, and those who knew the skills wrote down their various recipes and kept them secret from one another and from the general public, passing them on down through their families and to their apprentices as a means of making a living. I mean, they didn't have copyright in those days. That's the only way you could preserve things to make sure that something of value was kept in the family, so to speak. Well, of course, in the Middle Ages, all that really changed. The quest developed for something called the lapis philosophorum, or the Philosopher's Stone. And the idea behind this was quite simple. If you had the stone, it was kind of like a magical talisman that you could use it to give you longevity. You could use it to, you could project it onto base metals and turn them into gold of the finest purity. It was really something extraordinary. And of course, this lent itself to all sorts of deceptions and delusions and wishful thinking, which is kind of how we tend to think of alchemy today, as being a kind of pirate's charter, a snake oil salesman's principal means of tricking people into investing in what they think will be a great money-making expertise, but actually is just a means of charlatans making a living. And of course, the epitome of that was Edward Kelly, the associate of Dr. John Dee, who in the 16th century went to Prague and got the emperor himself to invest in him, even made him a knight, on the basis that he was able to carry out alchemical works and produce the finest gold. In fact, all he was doing was getting gold from other sources, melting it down and pretending that he'd made it. And of course, once he was found out, that was the end of him. I think he was beheaded. So alchemy has this kind of murky reputation, and I want us to get away from that, to look into what was really going on in the philosophy in the Middle Ages and see if there's anything of interest in that for us today, in the way that we want to look at alchemy. Now then, in the West, of course, alchemy, the classical alchemy of the ancient Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans, that all disappeared with the Dark Ages. Everything, the libraries got burnt, various writings were suppressed by the church as being considered heretical, and the whole thing what was left of it went underground, but most of it was lost. That wasn't the case in the East. Had a different history there, and a lot of these early Greek writings particularly were translated into Arabic following the Muslim conquest and were kept alive there. And so these writings, which had completely disappeared in the West, survived. And one of the most important of these, which I'm going to read out to you now, is the so-called Emerald Table of Hermes. Now, I mentioned in the first lecture that the Greeks equated the Egyptian god Thoth, who is supposedly the inventor of all sciences, with their own god Hermes, but to distinguish him from the young lad with the hat with the wings on it and the sandals with wings on, the messenger of the gods, they call this one Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great. And this is his emerald table. And it starts off, true without error, certain and most true. That which is above is like that which is below, and that which is below is as that which is above, to perform the miracles of the one thing. And as all things were from one, by the mediation of one, so from this one thing came all things by adaptation. Its father is the sun, its mother is the moon. The wind carried it in its belly. The nurse thereof is the earth. It is the father of all perfection, and the consummation of the whole world. Its power is integral if it be turned to earth. Thou shalt separate the earth from the fire, the subtle from the coarse, gently and with much ingenuity. It ascends from earth to heaven, and descends again to earth, and receives the power of the superiors and the inferiors. Thus thou hast the glory of the whole world. Therefore let all obscurity flee from thee. This is the strong fortitude of all fortitude, overcoming every subtle and penetrating every solid thing. Thus the world was created. Hence are all wonderful adaptations, of which this is the manner. Therefore am I called Hermes the thrice great, having the three parts of the philosophy of the whole world. That is finished which I have to say concerning the operation of the sun. So there we have, in a nutshell, what the Hermetic philosophy of alchemy is all about. It's about some one thing, we're not told what that one thing is, which through adaptation does everything and has various powers, those above, those below, and we have to work with it, separating out the subtle from the gross, the fire from the earth. And this was considered almost like the catechism of the alchemists. They all knew this poem by heart, and they were all scratching their heads trying to work out exactly what it meant and commentating on it and writing and drawing lots of pictures to illustrate it, as well as following all their other texts. Now, in the East, of course, there are various Arab philosophers who carried on the work of the ancient Egyptians and others that existed before, doing their own work. And they translated the works of Zosimus of Panopolis, and he was an Alexandrian who lived in the 3rd century AD. It's around the same time as the Hermetica themselves were being written. I mentioned the Hermetica in the last lecture. It's a collection of philosophical writings, quite Platonic in their form, in the dialogues between a teacher and his student. But they give the last glimmerings of the ancient Egyptian view of the earth, which is a very feeling philosophy. That's what differentiates it particularly from Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy is all from the head. The Egyptian philosophy, particularly the Hermetica, comes from the heart. And you begin to understand that these people had a deep inner understanding of how nature and everything in it worked within their concepts. And they were the ones who introduced this whole idea of as above, so below. As just the way that God created the universe, so everything down here has been created. And if you want to be a successful alchemist, you've actually got to follow the principles that God followed. You've got to be like him and do his work, which is not so very different, actually, from what our scientists do today. The Great Hadron Collider in Switzerland is trying to reveal what happened at the moment of creation. It's actually trying to emulate the very beginnings of the universe. And if that's not trying to do God's work here on earth, what is? So this is actually a tradition that goes way back, right back to ancient philosophy, and is actually the principle that was being followed by the ancient alchemists too. Now, Zosimus' works are imbued by the Hermetic ideas, but also concepts taken from the Bible. He taught that there are two sources of wisdom from the ancient world, the Egyptian and the Hebrew. And he writes, there are two sciences and two wisdoms, that of the Egyptians and that of the Hebrews, which latter is confirmed by divine justice. The science and wisdom of the most excellent dominate the one and the other. Both originate in olden times. Their origin is without a king, autonomous and immaterial. It is not concerned with material and corruptible bodies. It operates with the submitting to strange influences, supported by prayer and divine grace. The symbol of chemistry is drawn from the creation by its adepts, who cleanse and save the divine soul bound in the elements, and who free the divine spirit from its mixture with the flesh. In other words, the alchemists were freeing the soul and the spirit from matter, which is a very odd concept to us. Many people today have difficulty believing that even human beings have souls or spirits. But in those days, it was believed that everything that exists has a soul and a spirit. Even a pebble, even a plant and an animal, they all have souls, they all have spirit, just different gradations of the same. He goes on to say, as the sun is, so to speak, a flower of the fire, and simultaneously the heavenly sun, the right eye of the world, so copper, when it blooms, that is, when it takes the colour of gold through purification, becomes a terrestrial sun, which is king of the earth, as the sun is king of heaven. So what he's aiming to do, the alchemist, is to take copper and help it mature to become gold. Gold was regarded as mature. Copper and the other metals regarded as immature. He's going to help it become as the sun is in the heaven, the flower of the sky, the eye of God. So he's going to help this immature metal copper become mature so it can become a flower of the earth and flowering like gold. Now, they also equated the prophet Trismegistus, Hermes Trismegistus, Thoth, was also equated with Enoch, the prophet of the Hebrews. And he was the first person in the Bible who's said to have been taken straight to heaven, body and soul, without having to die first. The second person to do this was Elijah, carried off in his chariot of fire while his pupil Elisha is watching. And then the third person to do this is, of course, Jesus Christ, who's in the New Testament is taken off in the cloud. He disappears with his apostles watching on as he ascends to heaven. Enoch, therefore, represents the possibility of immortality. And this idea, too, gets incorporated into alchemy, the quest for the elixir of eternal life. So I was mentioning, about the lapis philosophorum. This is kind of where the idea comes from. The philosopher, the archetypal philosopher, in a sense, is Enoch. Enoch was the great-grandfather of Noah in the Bible. He's antediluvian. He's much older than Moses. And in the ideas of medieval times, the older the philosophy, the closer it is to Adam, therefore the closer it is to God and the creation. So Enoch must know more than Moses does. Therefore Enoch's writings are richer and better to study than those of Moses. Now I know that's not what we would think today, and a lot of these Hermetic writings actually are not that old. They date from the early Christian era and were written in Alexandria. But people in the Middle Ages, or certainly once these writings were coming back into the West, certainly believed that they were that ancient. They were antediluvian, before Noah. So if you could work out the teachings of Enoch, the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, and put them into practice, you would get back to this earlier world, at the Golden Age. This is the other great idea that comes through, is the idea that ages on Earth have been going down in quality. Originally there was the Golden Age, when men didn't have to work. The fruits grew on the trees. You were fed by the earth. Then came the Silver Age. You had to start hunting for everything that you needed. And then the Bronze Age. During the Bronze Age, people start having to grow things. They have to farm. They have to do things, work, the sweat of their brow, like Adam. And they start fighting. And that gets even worse in the Iron Age, when everything's conflict and empires being built and falling and so forth. We're living still in the Iron Age. So there was this looking back to the Golden Age, the age when mankind, time, before the fall, really, when things were good and people were immortal. And that the keys to finding out how to get back there might be contained in these Hermetic writings within alchemy. And that's another reason why people were studying these texts with alacrity and trying to put together the jigsaw puzzle, bits and pieces of it, because it wasn't all being given to them. There wasn't one person who could stand there and say, right, here it is, this is how it's been taught to me, and now I'm passing it on to you. There were mostly what we would today call scientists, investigating nature, investigating theories and ideas, taking writings that they gleaned from Zosimus and other people, experimenting with their kilns and their retorts, doing work on alchemy, working on trying to find this Philosopher's Stone in a practical sense. So in that sense, there were very, very modern people, scientists, investigating the world, trying to find out their way that we could get to be immortal. Now, Zosimus believed that alchemy had first been taught to mankind by the Nephilim, right? The Nephilim, the fallen angels of the Old Testament. And this again goes back to the book of Enoch, where we're told how a bunch of angels came, there'd been war in heaven, and these angels came down to earth, and they landed in Mount Hermon, which is on the borders of Syria and Israel and Lebanon, in that corner there. And these Nephilim looked upon the daughters of men and found they were fair, and they slept with them and begat giants. This is what we're told in the book of Enoch. And they taught the giants, and the giants taught, and they taught the women, the mothers of the giants, these various sciences. And this is looked upon in the book of Enoch as highly corrupt, actually, that they were teaching them how to become gods. And for this reason, they're judged. And Enoch is taken to heaven. This is before he dies. But he's taken on a journey to heaven where he meets with the archangels, and they instruct him and tell him he's got to go back to earth and tell these wicked fallen angels that they're going to have to be judged, they're going to be bound and cast down. And this is the substance of the first part, anyway, of the Book of Enoch, which is a very curious document, was preserved in Ethiopia, of all places, and was only actually brought back to the West, I think, in the 17th century, and was only actually translated in the 19th. And you can get copies now on Amazon if you want to read it. So the Book of Enoch, very interesting document, certainly seems to have been known of by Jesus, because he mentions it. Zosimus made use of religious ideas when talking about alchemy. In fact, he's probably the first person to do that, something which we now take for granted when looking at alchemical textbooks. You often find religious imagery being employed there. For example, When talking about processes involving the cleaning of gold or silver, they'll very often use pictures of baptism, using the metals being put into a baptismal font and coming out of a baptismal font, representing a kind of rebirth into a new state, better state, christened. These kind of ideas all came originally from Zosimus, who, being a Christian as zealot, really, as well as an alchemist, was very keen to link his studies with his religion. Well, Zosimus wasn't the only person to be talking about alchemy. The Muslims too were very, very keen on the whole subject, have we seen. And three people in particular stand out as exemplars of this: Al-Jibr, Avicenna, and Ibn Arabi, three great teachers of not just alchemy but other subjects as well within the early Muslim dispensation. If we take the first of these, man known to Western scholars as Al-Jibr. Now we probably think of Al-Jibr, we know his teachings about algebra. He's the person who invented algebra, to the annoyance of school children ever since. But he was a great scholar and wrote many books on many different subjects. When he's writing on alchemy, though, he deliberately made things difficult to understand. He would sort of hide his meanings behind flowery words. And as a result, his works were referred to in the West as gibberish, algebra gibberish. So we get this idea about alchemy being kind of a strange subject that you can't just read it and understand it. Now, of course, in part, that's like any science, that if someone picks up a science textbook and they've not been educated in that science, a lot of it will be gibberish. If you don't know the language of mathematics, it's complete gibberish. But there was something else, though, that he was, in a sense, protecting his copyrights, that he didn't want everybody to know the secrets of his alchemy. Only the select few that he was going to instruct, those who were worthy of having this knowledge, and certainly not the Christians in the West. So we get this idea of alchemy books being written in gibberish as a means of protecting the knowledge from those who are not worthy to receive it. And the next great alchemist was a Persian, who in the West we call Avicenna, an abbreviation of Abu Ali al-Hussein ibn Abd Allah ibn Sina. He, like Al-Jibr before him, was a polymath. He wrote many books on almost every subject under the sun, and he was particularly famous for his treatises on healing and healing techniques. In fact, the works of Avicenna were the Bible of medicine, really, up until about the 16th century, when the Enlightenment began. People began to investigate other means of doing things, and gradually his books became considered dated, as people were discovering what we would now call modern medicine. But Avicenna was a great writer of alchemy as well. And his greatest contribution was his invention for devices for distilling of essential oils from herbs and other vegetable sources, which of course you would need to do if you were going to be making healing potions. And he also reclassified solids into 4 groups. There were lapides, that's stones, there was sulfur, there was salts and metals. The addition of sulfur and salt to stones and metals had a great influence on the future development of alchemy in Europe. So beginning to get, again, this idea of alchemy being a progressive science, that people are finding new ways of doing things. How do you distill herbal extracts and, using chemical distillation processes, and also developing the theoretical basis that you don't just have stones and salts. You also have you have sulfurs and metals. So having 4 instead of 2, we've multiplied that manifold now as we've discovered all the elements. And the third great Arabic alchemist was Ibn Arabi, Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Ali ibn Muhammad ibn Arabi. Bit of a mouthful. You can understand why people just call him Ibn Arabi. He was born in Andalusia in Spain, and he was a Sufi, which means that he was involved with the sort of more mystical branch of Islam, Sufism. He didn't stay in Spain. He moved out to Persia, I believe, but he became a great writer again on everything to do with alchemy. But he particularly liked using flowery language of love and marriage to describe how the elements were reacting one with another. And this again is something that comes through in everything that's later on written about alchemy. The whole idea of the chemical wedding becomes inextricably linked with alchemy. And in fact, we also have this somewhat today with our idea of metals and non-metals and the way they bind together in sort of marriage, their bonds, their chemical bonds that hold them together. This mystical language describing the way that matter behaves. And the chemical marriage itself was often illustrated in manuals and books of alchemy, certainly after Ibn Arabi's time, as a marriage between a king and queen. So we can see it here in this particular image here, with the king and the queen are being married, and they've got a bishop that's putting them together. We'll be explaining that diagram in more detail in a later lecture. But in the West, many people were dismissive of alchemy, thinking it just a load of nonsense. But it gradually began to regain its footings, and at least among a select few. Usually these were clergymen. I mean, if you were a clergyman, it meant you had plenty of time on your hands, which is kind of necessary if you're going to be attending an alchemical kiln for any length of time. But also, you could use your alchemy as an excuse for doing things which were, perhaps slightly disapproved of. I mean, you couldn't sort of openly say, oh, I'm going to study astrology, or not usually anyway, or I'm going to get into magic. You'd be burnt at the stake if you did. But if you talked about alchemy, I'm looking for how God has wonderfully made this world, and how we can turn base metals into gold, help them to flower into their true purpose, that sort of language, you could get away with it. And not only that, you might get a patron, someone who's rich, that would sponsor you in the hope that in due course, once you had found out the secret, that you would share this with them, and they too would make masses of gold and become even richer. So very often the alchemy in the West drew these clergymen to be the chief investigator. As the intellectual climate in Europe also changed following the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The Eastern Empire, most of it had already been conquered long before this, but Constantinople itself, which we now call Istanbul, had held out almost like an island in an Islamic world. In 1453, the Turks administered the coup de grace, and it was captured. And those intellectuals, or those people in Constantinople who could, fled. Many others were, of course, enslaved, or they had to carry on as best they could. But those who could either paid their way to get out or escaped, taking with them what possessions they could carry. And of course, one possessions they could carry were books, particularly the Hermetica, which were, as we talked about earlier, and were taken to Florence, but also books on alchemy. So these people moved to the West and they brought with them further ideas. But even before then, there were Westerners who were investigating what the Arabs had to teach about alchemy, as well as other subjects like astronomy, philosophy, and so forth. And one of these was Raymond Lowell, very, very famous in his day and throughout the sort of medieval period. He came from Majorca and made it his life's task to go and convert the Muslims to Christianity, which anybody could have told him probably is not the most sensible thing to attempt. And in fact, he got stoned to death for his pains. But before then, he went to North Africa, to Morocco, and he was able to learn a lot about what the Muslims had to teach. He learnt how to speak Arabic, and so he was able to read their texts and to bring back to the West certain ideas on alchemy. And a lot of books were written, some of them by him, but a lot of later books were also written posthumously and attributed to him. And this, again, was a common thing at the time, that if I wanted to write a book, my name's not big enough, nobody's going to buy it if I write it, so I'll attribute it, perhaps Raymond Lowell or some other great luminary from the past, and then people think, oh, this is great stuff, yeah, this is the real McCoy, and we'll get into it. So there's a great corpus of writing of pseudo-Lullian text as well as genuine Lullian text, but both were extremely influential on the future development of alchemy. And coming closer to home, another prominent alchemist, a very influential figure, was someone called Thomas Norton from Bristol. And he wrote a long poem called Ordinal, which means the order of things or regulations. And in it he gives a cryptic form, a description of the work and the steps needed for its accomplishment. And I'll read out a bit of this. Of the gross work now will I not spare, though it be secret largely to declare. To teach you the truth is mine intent, as far forth as I dare for God's command meant. Now, this idea of writing about your alchemy in poetry was very much the vogue of that period. People would write these long, flowery poems, went on and on and on, even more recondite than some of Ibn Arabi's or Al-Jiber's texts in concealing their true meaning. But these poems were very popular and they were published and people read them and meditated on them and drew pictures to illustrate them. So Thomas Dawson became a major figure. And another important figure from British alchemy, or English alchemy even, was Sir George Ripley, the Canon of Bridlington. Now, he was evidently a man of the cloth. He obtained permission from the Pope to leave his monastery where he lived to spend some years travelling and studying alchemy. And it's debatable whether he ever went back to the monastery. I mean, he was obviously, if he's Sir George, he must have been a knight and perhaps had a bit of private income to enable him to do some of this work. But at any rate, he wrote a book, a very influential book, called The 12 Gates, which are named after chemical processes which are still recognisable today. And in the very late 15th and early 16th century, there were some marvellous scrolls were drawn up with great illustrations for his poem his poems about alchemy. So again, we have this idea that the poetry and the philosophy put into the poetry later becomes the inspiration for the art. And nowadays we tend to think of the alchemy as being just the art, the poems being really obscure. But the two were taken together, and people worked with this, and they used these poems and these artistic drawings as practical manuals for their own work in trying to unravel what this subject is really all about. And I'll just quickly go through his 12 gates. There's calcination, solution, separation, conjunction, putrefaction, Cybation, sublimation, fermentation, exaltation, multiplication, and projection. These are just words, but they are actually descriptive, quite a few of them, of chemical processes that we use today, things like sublimation, for instance. We would add other ones like distillation, but these are certainly, it's beginning, you can see how the alchemy is beginning to move towards becoming a genuine science of chemistry with recognizable methods, methodology to go with the poetry, to go with the wisdom of the ancients, and so on and so forth, and just the straightforward recipe books that we had from the Egyptians. And a third hugely influential alchemist of the period, of the late 15th century, was Basil Valentine, who was a canon of the Benedictine Priory at Erfurt in Germany. And he seems to have been a very active experimenter as well as a philosopher, and wrote many books. Among his discoveries were methods for making ammonia and also hydrochloric acid from salty water. So again, we're moving forwards now from the basic alchemy of transforming things into gold to a wider chemistry. People are beginning to understand that in the processes of doing all this alchemical work, some very useful materials are being formed, like ammonia, that you can use for other purposes, hydrochloric acid. And we're beginning to get a chemistry set with a lot of useful reagents, as well as the basic materials that we'd started out with. And picking up perhaps on the 12 gates of Sir George Ripley, Valentine also wrote the 12 keys of alchemy. Now, there seems to be a bit of plagiarism going on here. The idea being that the keys perhaps can open the doors of Sir George Ripley's 12 gates. But although they're much the same, they're anything but clear, and Valentine uses all manner of wordplay to disguise his real meaning. Thus, when the book was eventually published in 1599, it was only natural that it be illustrated with the sort of cryptic illustrations we've come to associate with alchemy. And you can see one here where we have actually got a picture of Valentine, the monk, in one side of the drawing. We've got Hermes Trismegistus, the recognisable figure in his Arab dress, holding his armillary sphere. And we can see in the Hermes side, we've got a set of panpipes, and the panpipes have got the symbols of the 7 planets of the ancients above them. And we can see how the idea is there that the 7 notes of the musical scale tie in somehow with the 7 planets, perhaps harking back to Pythagoras and his music of the spheres. And then we see the same thing on the other side of the picture. We've got Basil Valentine, and he's got 7 pipes with 7 symbols of the practica of his methods there. linking in somehow with the 7 planets. So he's kind of drawing on the wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus, but also developing new uses for it. And that again is kind of what's happening at that period of time. People are taking the old philosophy, but they're also trying to explore new ideas. And in some ways they're hampered by the old philosophy because it's stopping them looking in a wider perspective. But in other ways it provides them with a secure foundation for what they're doing, their Aristotelian basis for the work that they're carrying on. And this whole idea of the diagrams telling a story in themselves reaches its absolute epitome with the publication in 1622 of this remarkable book, Philosophia Reformata by Johann Mylius, which is published by the De Bry printers in Oppenheim, a great Rosicrucian publishing house. This book was heavily illustrated throughout, taking all of the inspiration that it can find from everywhere about alchemy. And we'll be looking at quite a few of these illustrations in one of the later lectures. But we can begin again to see how there's this, with the invention of the printing press and the way that printing was being used to disseminate knowledge, people were starting to pack it all together. Let's bring it all in together to make ourselves a definitive book on alchemy, a definitive text, the Philosophia Reformata. And of course, later other books were published in England particularly to bring together as many texts as possible so that the practicing alchemist had it all there in his library. He could look it all up and study it and work with it. And ultimately it led to the point where people like Isaac Newton were experimenting with alchemy, and eventually Robert Boyle, who was an experimenter with alchemy, and gradually out of this was born our whole subject of chemistry. But before we go into that, I want to say a little bit more about the processes that were involved in alchemy. So if we look, we see there's calcination. We see here there's a substance, usually an ore of some sort, is heated strongly in a crucible. The ore decomposes and gives off gases. In the case of sulfides, these can include sulfur dioxide, which in turn can be collected and used to make sulfuric acid. You know, if you heat certain sulfides very strongly in air, they will oxidize and the sulfur dioxide will come off, and you can collect that. You can dissolve it in water, which makes sulfurous acid, expose that to air, and it'll oxidize to become sulfuric acid. So we can see how the chemical process of calcination is very, very important, not just for the beginnings of the process of separating out metals from their ores, but also for getting reagents for making other things. For instance, if you heat up chalk very strongly, calcium carbonate, it will give off carbon dioxide, and you can collect that. If you then mix that slaked lime, the quick lime that you get from that with water, it makes slaked lime and gives off hydrogen gas, and you can collect that. So these chemical processes, actually, a lot of them come out of these very basic techniques that were being invented and developed around this time. And the second one we have here, the second process called solution. And as the name suggests, it's a process by which something solid is dissolved, usually in water. So you can imagine if you've got crystals of salt or whatever, it could be copper sulfate. You dissolve them in water, and once you've got them in solution, you can start doing reactions with them. We take that for granted in chemistry today, but it wasn't so obvious to people in the past, and needed to be stated, it needed to be developed and worked with. The alchemists are the people we have to thank for that. And the third one is separation. And again, you want to separate things out, one from another. In this particular drawing that we have here, they're using mercury to do the separation. It can be just things like separating out an oil from water. Some things are dissolved in the water, some things will dissolve in the oil. You can separate them out into two levels. And then we have conjunction, and that's the marriage of two things together. Let me take an example. If you have sulfur with iron and heat it up very strongly, you can make iron sulfide. It will bind together to make a compound. So this is beginnings of other kinds of chemistry where you're actually, instead of separating everything out into different metals and substances, you're bringing things together to make useful compounds. Then we have putrefaction. Now, we tend to think of putrefaction as just being the rotting down of things, but actually what it's about is taking something complex. It could be like a human body, a dead body, it putrefies, but it could be other things too, and breaking it down into its more basic parts, simpler parts, which you can then use for other things. When we think mostly in the compost heap, where things putrefy and then we can use the composted material to feed the garden with. And alchemists were using the same ideas and techniques, perhaps with less success than gardeners into their compost heaps, but they were using the same ideas for some of the things that they were doing. And then we have conjulation. That's when something congeals together. It kind of, you get a precipitate happening. And an obvious example is if you take milk and you squeeze lemon into it, congeals, the fatty substance separates out to form what you can then use for cheese, I guess. Then we have cybation, where you take a number of things, put them together into a crucible and heat them strongly to cause certain transformations. And sublimation, where you heat something up and it gives off vapours which then condense to form a solid in a cooler part of the apparatus, which you can then scrape off, sometimes as a powder, sometimes as crystals. An obvious example of this actually is the soot that you get from an ordinary fire going up the chimney and sublimating inside the chimney. We use these processes a lot in chemistry today, and this was understood by the alchemists, and they used this a very great deal when they were actually trying to make their gold. They would get a white powder made from sublimation of the other materials that they'd been heating up together, and then they would mix this powder with their copper, and it would make something which was actually brass. Probably zinc oxide was the actual substance that they were sublimating, but they didn't realise it, and they mix that and they get in their copper and they get brass, which looks like gold. We know it's not gold, but in those days, originally speaking, you could call it gold because anything that looks like gold is gold. You say, well, it's not natural gold, this is philosophical gold. It's been made by philosophers instead of God. But, it would have a certain value, not as much as gold, real gold, but it would have a certain value. And then we get fermentation. Well, again, we think of fermentation when you put yeast into wine and it blub, 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 into grape juice and blub, 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 it makes wine. But also fermentation is the idea of you throw the seed onto the ground and then it regenerates and it's reborn. So they were taking the seed of their metal, so they would think, throwing it into their solution or their materia that they're going to make into gold, so it will grow, the seeds will grow and form more gold for them, or so they hope. And then we have three more processes: exaltation, multiplication, and projection. All of these really are very similar to the fermentation that we were looking at earlier, where you're trying to take what you've got and multiply it and make it bigger, make more of it. And it seems to be that these keys were included to make up the magic number 12 rather than just 9. Now, in addition to these processes of sublimation and cybation and solution and so forth, there were also recognised 4 distinct stages to the work that you would see, I've reached this level here, stage number 1, I've achieved that, right. Now I must do X, Y and Z to get to stage number 2, 3, 4. But before you could even go into your stages, you had to find your first material. And the first material, the prima materia, as they call it, is the subject which is the most obscure of all in these texts. They never tell you exactly what is the first material. So the poor old alchemists, you've got to feel for them. They wanted to do all this stuff. They said, yeah, right, I'm going to do all these processes. I've got all my apparatus, I bought it in the shop. I'm all raring to go. Now, what do I start with? And he reads through the text and it doesn't tell him what he wants. So they would experiment on all sorts of different things. They might say, well, what would be the first material? Or it must be coal. Right, I'll try coal. No, it doesn't work. It goes through all the stuff and no, it hasn't worked. So he thinks, well, maybe it's some kind of vegetable thing. So you get some wood or some rose petals or no, none of that works. So then you think, it must be the dew of the morning. So they collect the dew of the morning. No, it doesn't work. Oh dear, maybe it's blood, maybe it's urine, maybe it's feces, maybe, they tried everything they could think of. The descriptions they get, if you look into the alchemical text, suggest that it's some kind of a dragon. Why on earth a dragon? Well, first of all, you've got to find your dragon. Not easy. And then you found your dragon, you've got to subdue it. And it seems that to subdue your dragon, you need the sun and the moon, which in earthly terms are represented by gold and silver. So you need a bit of gold and a bit of silver, and you can use those to subdue your first matter, whatever that might be. And then you can take your first matter and you can start heating it up, roasting it. And that will then give off various gases, and which are shown in this particular diagram as winged birds, because obviously, gases fly, they go up into the air. And eventually you end up with something which begins to look like some kind of a very hot salamander. And under the fierce heat, the volatile fractions of the materia medica released. The lion probably represents sulfuric acid, while the eagle would be some other volatile element in this particular picture. Most likely, the real first material, if they did but know it, I expect some of them did, was an ore of copper. And it was probably a mineral ore, and they would roast that in air. Sulfur dioxide and maybe hydrogen sulfide or even pure sulfur would be released. And the first two, poisonous. I wonder how many alchemists actually poisoned themselves with sulfur dioxide or hydrogen sulfide or some other poisonous gas. Many of their reactions that they were playing around with would give off arsenic, which is extremely toxic taken in any quantity. So these poor old guys, they probably had their teeth falling out and they're not looking at all well. Anyway, so if you found your first material and you roast it hard enough, you get the first stage of the alchemical process, which is called Negredo, the black stuff. And this is shown in various pictures, alchemical texts. This is a particularly good one. It shows here the black substance as a bunch of feathers beneath these androgynous twins. They're kind of like the hidden potentiality contained in this substance. The black stuff, in reality, if they did but know it, was probably copper oxide, black copper, and that would form as a slag at the bottom of your alchemical kiln or whatever it is that you're working on, and you could then collect that and start using that for the next process of the work. This is something the Egyptians have been doing thousands of years before, if the alchemists did but know it. Fortunately, they didn't have the Leiden papyrus to guide them. They only had these later texts, which had perhaps had some influence from the Leiden papyrus filtered through Islamic alchemy, coming back through medieval alchemy with loads of pictures and poems and flowery stuff and all sorts of Baroque ideas thrown onto it. If they did but know it, what they needed was to do is to take a copper ore, perhaps copper carbonate, heat it strongly and end up with copper oxide as a black material, the Negredo. And then they carry out further processes on this material. They dissolve it, they do this and that to it, they marry it, they add things to it, la-di-da-di-da. And eventually they come out with something precipitated into their tube, which they call the peacock's tail. And they say, at last I have the peacock's tail. Well, very likely the peacock's tail, which was a blue substance, was very likely copper sulfate. And the way you get copper sulfate is you dissolve your copper oxide in sulfuric acid. So if they collected their sulfur dioxide from their earlier processes, dissolved that in water, and made sulfuric acid, they could then add that to their copper oxide and get copper sulfate, which would be their peacock's tail. They've now got their copper in solution, and they can do other chemical processes with it, such as adding their zinc oxide and perhaps getting the basis, the beginnings of making their brass. They didn't realise that was what they were making, but that was certainly the truth of the matter, probably. So they get their peacock's tail, and they want to get to the third stage, which is, a very important stage, one of the most important, which is the white stone. When you've got the white stone, you can make silver. Yes, so this is the first great accomplishment. But what are you to make of this when you look at this picture and you see the white stone? It's not represented as a crystal that you might think like maybe a diamond or some other white stone. It's shown as an androgynous figure standing on a little hillock, and he's got a lead where he's holding what looks like a lion on the lead, and he's got a rod that he's pointing at a serpent. And next to him there's growing a tree with moons on it, fruits of the moon. That represents the growth of silver. So your white stone, it's somehow to do with something androgynous. It's to do with controlling the lion. It's to do with being able to command the serpent to do what you want. The serpent perhaps represents Mercury. What are you to make of this? Well, the reality, again, was probably we're talking about a sublimate, really, a white powder that you scrape off that the ancients used to call arsem, the ancient Egyptians, that you can mix with your various materials to make either the silver material, or you can mix it to make your gold material. So this is where your white stone comes in. It's actually a chemical compound. It's probably is aluminium oxide or zinc oxide or magnesium oxide, something of that sort, which you could then use to add to other materials, to your copper particularly, to make something that would look silvery, like white gold. And then, having achieved the great achievement of the white stone, you then also want to make the red stone. And the red stone, again, is shown by an even more mysterious diagram. This one's taken from the Rosarium Philosophorum, amazing book which was written in the 16th century, became one of the inspirations for the Johann Mylius book. As I said, Johann Mylius, Philosophia Reformata of 1622, brought all these different images together and put them into one big book. So here, cop that, see what you can make of it. Well, this is supposed to be the greatest accomplishment, the making of the red stone. And we can only scratch our heads and wonder what this red stone is. Was it mercuric oxide? That's red. A cinnabar it's called. Anyway, here it's shown as, again, a hermaphroditic figure. This time he's standing on his little hillock, and beneath him is a three-headed dragon, and there's a pelican pecking at itself. He's holding aloft in his right hand a chalice with three serpents coming out of it, and in his other hand he's holding a serpent. Well, I suggest that the serpents represent Mercury, that is Hermes. The three serpents suggest that he's now like Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Mercury. And he's holding the other one, saying, I have bound Mercury. And he's making his gold. So the gold tree represents the gold. So we've got here the other material that perhaps you're going to now project onto Mercury to make your gold, or you're taking your mercuric oxide, and you're projecting that onto your copper that you've already made in your other processes, and now it's copper sulfate or some such. And you're doing your chemical processes on that to make your gold. And that seems to be kind of where medieval alchemy got to in terms of its chemical processes. And we can see here a mixture of different influences. We can see the ancient Egyptian influence coming through, filtered through all these different elements, through the forgotten teachings in the West, through the Islamic alchemy that was developed its own way, filtered on through the kind of pictorial imagination of the medieval period, and put together into some kind of a system that they thought that they could work with. In reality, they probably couldn't, but it contains a lot of information for us today that we can work with. And in the next lecture, I'm going to show how a gentleman called Carl Jung, famous psychologist, tried to take hold of these images and use them as an explanation of psychology. And then later on in the lecture after that, I'm going to go into the whole deeper level of alchemy and how it actually relates to us and transformations within the human body. Thank you very much.